to AP European History with Dr. Brovkin. We continue to study the English Revolution and Civil War. Last time we focused on the rule of the Lord Protector, Oliver Cromwell. Today I want to comment a little bit about the assessment of his rule and some of the things that happened during his rule, and then move to the final topic of this discussion, which would be the period of restoration of Charles II and James, leading to the Glorious Revolution. So the most important thing to emphasize is that the English Revolution happened because of the dispute of the Parliament and the King. And the idea was that the Parliament should rule by law, that the King should rule by law, that the whole system should be a cooperative arrangement between the Parliament and the head of state. That's the beginning. This is the objective. The king should not impose taxes. They couldn't arrest arbitrarily, couldn't execute anybody, should have a fair process of law. All these things that sound so good and so nice, and everybody emphasizes this is the English tradition. Well, here I venture to argue the opposite. The English tradition, actually, of that revolution, the practice that we had is probably the worst that you had in Europe at that time. This is the period of ethnic cleansing. This is a period of mass murder in Drogheda and many other Irish towns. This is the period of crop destruction as a state policy, which I call state terrorism. Deliberate destruction of crops so that people starve. That's something that was practiced by Cromwell government. Starvation as a policy. Arbitrary arrest and execution of Catholic priests in Ireland. I mean, that's by far worse than anything that Charles I had ever been accused of. Moreover, there were laws passed by an illegal entity called the Rump Parliament, which is like a third of the original one, and these are called penal laws against Catholic Church. So Catholic service was banned. That's good enough for tolerance, so much praised in England. Essentially, have a minority over minority in the army that seized power and installed Cromwell. And Cromwell's favorite method is use of force. He was so good at suppressing rebellions, first of the Irish, and then of the Scottish, and then of the English, that he got into the habit of using force whenever he had a chance. The only positive thing for me in this whole dark years of the English Revolution is the appeals of the levelers. Because really, if we look at what they actually said, extended suffrage, equality before the law, and religious tolerance, these are the issues that finally were adopted in the Bill of Rights after the Glorious Revolution, after decades of suffering. And these are what we usually associate with the English Revolution. But it was not what was practiced by Oliver Cromwell and those who won in the Civil War. So, the judgment of Cromwell is very interesting. He is officially considered a great hero. Because, why? Well, because of imperial legacy of the English Empire. He united by force England, Scotland, and Wales, and Ireland by blood and force. He imposed the rule of the Anglican Church. He passed penal laws against Catholics. He basically by force united something that was inherited later on by English kings. He basically established something that would last for 200 years, which is a parliament run by the landlords and landlords only. He averted a social revolution. He installed the dictatorship of himself as instead of a parliament that would also later on transform itself into a dictatorship of the parliament. So in many ways, he is a crucial figure. But for the Irish, they speak the word Cromwell with the expression curse on Cromwell to the present day. I think more worse things were not done except in the 30 Years' War. And he poisoned the relationship of the Irish and the English to the present day. and that is probably his most important legacy. Okay, now one more thing about his rule, and that is in 1655, that's 2 years after he was proclaimed Lord Protector of the Commonwealth, there was a royalist uprising. And here's one more, we wouldn't even notice it if it wasn't for his response, which was also very innovative. The result was that he divided England into 15 military districts, and the governor of each of those military districts is subordinate to himself personally, not to the rump, not to the parliament, not to even state council, which he created, but to him personally, which really exemplifies the, the military dictatorship. And these are not my words. This is Winston Churchill, military dictatorship of Oliver Cromwell. Now, these governors or military commanders were in charge of collecting taxes, watching over religion. This is very interesting. This is the beginnings of Bolshevism. Like, you watch out the ideology and what people believe in and what people think. And ensure security, which is, sorry for the comparison, the beginning of KGB. Sort of political police, political and religious police. Fortunately for England, these inventions didn't stay long and they collapsed. But they did offer him a post of a king in 1657, which he wisely rejected and decided to continue to be Lord Protector. But he did nominate his son, Richard, to inherit his power when he felt that he was dying. And he did die in 1560. But his son was not good enough in keeping the instruments of power because he didn't have any institutional support. It was all based on Cromwell's personality, charisma, his personal control of the army. And Richard very quickly found that he couldn't control any of those. Now, what happens next is George Monk is the one of the officers in the new model army. He brings the army that used to be so loyal to Oliver Cromwell. He comes to London and he restores the Long Parliament. In other words, people who had been silent for all these years are now back to the Parliament. The Parliament invites Charles II to come back and be a king. And he didn't anticipate such a turn of events at all. It was a total news to him. So they negotiate on what terms he's going to come. And he agrees to the terms, which is that he would rule with the consent of the Parliament, and that he would not do any reprisals, that the property of new owners will be respected, and there'd be no reprisals except for the very few who signed the death warrant against his father. So this is what the conditions are. He comes and is invested as a king, and 9 people are executed. And then the very interesting thing, they dug up the body of Cromwell. They quartered it. They put his chopped off head on a pole and exhibited it publicly for some months to come. So much hatred there was on the part of Charles II to the murderer of his father. So this brings us to the new period in English history, which is the Restoration, the rule of Charles II. And let's briefly look at it, what happens. First of all, there were new elections to the new Parliament, free and fair, so to speak. But again, it's only the landlords who vote. And the new Parliament was, amazingly for everybody, a cavalier government, a cavalier Parliament, which means mostly royalists. They were in the majority of the new Parliament. And they also proclaimed that there will be Anglican supremacy. So it's not going to be banning of the Catholic Church. They wouldn't be allowed to exist. Some degree of toleration will be there, but there will be supremacy of Anglican Church in England. Also needs to be mentioned is that the theaters are allowed to open. Basically, the reign of Charles II is associated with kind of loosening up and of the strict morality and the military rule. Things are beginning to appear to be normal. There's a parliament, there's election, theaters are reopened, there's no more strictures in dress and code behavior, there's no arbitrary arrests and uprisings and executions. It sort of comes back to normal life, more or less. Uh, in 1672, all penal laws that were put into effect by Oliver Cromwell are abolished. So there's no more discrimination against Catholics or Calvinists. There's also all kinds of what they call libertine plays. There's a lot of sexuality, and there are a lot of promiscuous kind of cabarets and pubs and things. It's just much more loose atmosphere with some cynicism and obviously a great degree of freedom in expression that characterizes this age. Now, the problem of Charles is that he doesn't have children. Well, his wife gets pregnant many times, but it's miscarriages all the time. So he doesn't have an heir. If he doesn't have any kids, the next in line to the English throne is his brother, James, James II. And that is scary because James is a Catholic, and they really are terrified with the prospect of having a Catholic king again. To avoid this, something important happens. There's James has a daughter, and her name is Mary. And Mary is married to Prince of Orange in Netherlands. And she goes there, and his name is William of Orange, and she becomes Protestant because that's what her husband is in Netherlands. And therefore, you do have a very interesting combination that nobody at that time thought would turn out to be important, but it will be important. Mary and her husband William will actually inherit the throne. But for the moment, you have Charles II, and he is desperate to have a successor. He does have a male successor, but it was from illegitimate relationship, so that couldn't be a king. He does have a son, and he makes him a lord. Anyway, in 1685, James becomes king. Charles dies, and the new king is James, his brother, James II, from 1685 to 11th of December 1688. Now, James felt himself more free, and his rule is short, but it's a constant struggle with the parliament. As soon as the parliament is elected, he dissolves it. And then a new one is elected, and he dissolves it. It's basically 3 years non-stop conflict with the parliament. He marries a Catholic woman, and a child is born who is Catholic. And that, of course, seals his fate. I mean, this is the moment when you have preparations for what the English official history calls glorious revolution, but in actual fact, it's a coup d'etat. It's a coup d'etat against a legitimate king. It's an invitation of a foreigner to take over your country. It's actually, strictly speaking, an act of treason. Because what the parliament does is behind the scenes prepares surrender of your country, of England, to a Dutch king. I mean, by any definition, this is treason. But that's what they do. Essentially, it's a coup d'etat against the father in favor of his daughter. There's some kind of speculation whether they will come, whether they would land, if they land, whether the English people are going to accept it. I mean, it's all very interesting moment, but everything goes smoothly. William, with a small escort of Dutch ships, does come to England, and they are proclaimed both William and Mary as king. So she's not just the wife of a king. She's a queen in her own right because she is actually the daughter of a king. And so her husband is a king too. So it's William and Mary. Actually, properly would be Mary and William because she kind of has the priority as she has legitimate rights as a daughter of the king. Now, this it brings to an end this age, but the most important thing to say here is the passing of the Bill of Rights the next year. And that is the foundation document of what today would be called parliamentary democracy. It does actually admit toleration, which would be very, very important because that would be practiced in America for various religious congregations. That would be very good for American colonies. And it also establishes a political system which is in effect today. Basically, it means the parliament rules, the king reigns, doesn't rule. The king is a figurehead that has to do pretty much everything that the parliament tells him. Now, that is what they say, but again, the practice was somewhat different, especially with the successors of William and Mary, because George the first and the second and the third, they all thought themselves to be divine right kings, and they all violated this rule many times, which brought England into big trouble, especially George the third policy in America, which led to the American Revolution. So it was not immediately the system of parliament rules, the king reigns. It was violated many times. Nevertheless, the principle was introduced that the parliament is in charge. And finally, last word about William and Mary. Usually nobody says anything about them except that they ruled and that they had no children. I was in Hampton Court near London. This is where they lived, and there's an exhibition about their reign and about their life, and I learned things that were quite surprising. One of them is, of course, they didn't have any children. The question is why? Well, they didn't have any children because he was gay. She was very, very unhappy. It was really, I feel very sorry for Mary, that for 5 years after they came to England and she is a queen, she died, probably out of despair or loneliness. And after she died, he was even more relaxed about his position and his lifestyle. He became fat and ugly. And essentially was tolerated by Parliament on the English throne, and everybody detested him. So it was a very unhappy situation, unhappy life for her and for England, that in the end, William and Mary's rule brought nothing. And they had to look for another dynasty. And finally, through a very complicated procedure of some blood relations, they found the closest relative in Hanover. And this is called the Hanoverian dynasty, which is still in England to the present day, starting with George the First, the second, the third, and then it goes on to the 19th and 20th century. So that's briefly the story of the English Revolution and Civil War. And now, don't forget to subscribe to AP European History with Dr. Brovkin. And put your likes in and tell all your friends that that is the best course on European history.